Okay, we've all heard that you can be your own best friend and your own worst enemy, right? We'd all like to think that we're our own best friend, but oftentimes we self-sabotage. We do things that are not in our best interest, or don't appear to be, at least at the moment, unless you see everything that's happening as a lesson that you are, that you need, we might need to learn some lessons, we might need to understand some things, so we make mistakes, and that's okay. But anyway, beyond that, what this video is about is this verse in the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 6, verse 5, that talks about this very issue. Or it depends how you understand it, right? How you translate it. And that's what we're going to do here. We're going to compare different translations. In fact, 18 different translations of this verse from some of the great translators of the Bhagavad Gita, including Shivananda, Eknath Easwaran, Sri Aurobindo, Srila Prabhupada, etc., etc. 18 different translations. I'm going to start with my own. I'm working on a translation right now. I'm almost finished. That's going to be out November 5th, 2024. So I'm going to start with the Sanskrit, and then I'm going to read my own translation, which is subject to change based on going through all the other translations and seeing if it does need to be changed. Maybe there are some things that need to be tweaked in what I did. I would never say that my translation is perfect. I don't think there is such a thing as a perfect translation. We're all doing our best, but anyway, here we go. I'm going to read this and then go through it line by line, word by word. Uddhared ātmanā-ātmānam, nātmānam avasādayet, ātmaiva hyātmano bandhur, ātma-eva ripur ātmanāh. All right. One should raise oneself by the self, uddhared ātmanā-ātmānam, not degrade oneself, na-ātmāna avasādayet. For truly the self alone is one's own friend, ātma-eva, he ātmana bandhu. And the self alone, ātma-eva, is one's own enemy, ripu ātmana. Now, the word atma or atman is used a lot here. It's used how many times? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 times in this one verse. In the real issue of translating this is, how do you translate? How do you translate this word? Do you translate it the same way each time? Are there some variations? Some people you'll see have mind for Atman. Some people have self. Some people might even have soul. Some people have oneself. Sometimes people have self with a capital S. Like one should raise oneself, right? Oneself by the self, meaning self with a capital S. Not degrade oneself. For truly the self alone is one's own friend. This is the self, this is the Atman in the highest sense of the term Atman, right? Or you could think in terms of there's the small self and the great self, the large self, the higher self, and the smaller individual self. Sometimes that higher self is called Brahman, but it's not called Brahman here, it's called Atman. And the self alone is one's own enemy. Now the question is, do you translate that last self as the enemy, capital S or lowercase s? Can the true self ever be one's enemy? Maybe so, because if you are out of alignment with that self, yeah, it can become your own enemy, because you're denying it, you're resisting it, you're fighting against it, right? So right now I have self with a lowercase s for that last line, but maybe I need to change that. Let's see what Winthrop Sargent says. by the way, the word ripu is enemy and bandhu is friend. Bandhu is friend, ripu is enemy. Ripu is not a word that you see that much. So it's an interesting word. So what is Winthrop Sargent? And I largely used his translation when I made my own. One should uplift oneself by the self. I had raise, he has, well, uplift, basically the same thing. One should not degrade oneself. And then one should not degrade. I left out the one should, and I just had not degrade oneself. So one should raise oneself by the self, not degrade oneself, and he had one should uplift oneself by the self, one should not degrade oneself. Basically the same thing. He has, for the self alone can be a friend to oneself, and I have for truly that the self alone is one's own friend, because it says eva he. Sometimes that eva does not really, it's kind of a filler. He generally is truly, means truly, like, or indeed, the self indeed, or the self truly. And sometimes eva is translated as alone. So truly the self alone is one's own friend, is what I had, and Sargent had, for the self alone can be a friend to oneself. So he has can be a friend, but the words don't say can be, as far as I'm aware. It's more like ātma-eva hi ātmana bandhu. Truly the self alone is one's own friend, and the self alone is one's own enemy. Now, I like can be too, though, because it's not always that way, right? But I was trying to translate it a little more exactly. He's doing more of, this is really kind of what it's, more of what it's saying, or what it's trying to say. So his translation's good. And he has self with a capital S. I think I'm going to change that capital S there as well. And the self alone is one's own enemy. And I understand why he would say can be, because you don't want to say the self is your enemy, can be your enemy, but it's not always your enemy, right? It can be your enemy for the reasons I said before. Like if you're out of touch with the self, yeah, it can be like an enemy to you. There's a verse that follows this one, by the way. We should read the next verse too, real quick here, because the next verse says more. It says, for him who has conquered himself by the self is a friend, but for him who has not conquered himself, the self remains hostile, like an enemy. So that's why I think Winthrop Sargent had can be. Yeah, and maybe can be is better, because it goes more with the next verse. So I might change that, actually. I think Winthrop Sargent had a better one. So let's go on. Swami Shivananda, let a man lift himself by his own self alone. Let him not lower himself. Same, right? For this self alone is the friend of oneself, and this self alone is the enemy of oneself. Now, this is closer to what I have, actually, than to what Winthrop Sargent has. And he has self lowercase. He doesn't have an uppercase self. But he has self uppercase in the first line. Let a man lift himself by his own self, uppercase, capitalized S. Capital S. Let him not lower himself, for this self alone is the friend of oneself, and this self alone is the enemy of oneself. In a way, I still like Winthrop Sargent, so I'm going to have to think more about that, right? I think Swami Shivananda saw the same thing I did, which is it does not say can be, it says is a friend, and it says is an enemy. It doesn't say can be. That's added to explain and to resolve, and to be in alignment with the next verse. Jayadayal Goyanka has, one should lift oneself by one's own efforts and should not degrade oneself. So he has efforts. Doesn't say that exactly, right? So I don't know if this is the best. For one's own self is one's friend, and one's own self is one's enemy. So that's also what I had, what Shivananda had, not what Winthrop Sargent had. We'll go on. I don't think the efforts. He's reading that into it. And it's not bad. It's not horrible, but it's kind of reading it into it. Swami Tadatmananda, you should raise yourself by yourself and not let yourself sink down. You are your own best friend and your worst enemy. Doesn't say best, and it doesn't say worst. That's kind of taking a modern colloquialism and importing it into the text, because it doesn't say that. Although the modern colloquialism might actually come from the Bhagavad Gita, for all we know. But in a sense, that's what it's saying, though. What he's saying is more or less what it's saying. You can be you can be your own friend, and you can be your own enemy, right? Depending on how you approach things. Aurobindo. This is the first time I'm using Sri Aurobindo. By the self you should deliver the self. Thou shouldst deliver the self. Thou shouldst not depress and cast down the self. And then in parentheses he has whether by self-indulgence or suppression. For the self is the friend of the self, and the self is the enemy. Okay, Shivananda, myself, he's got the same, right? He's in our camp. He doesn't have a capital S. He has a lowercase s. He has all lowercase s's here. Tadatmananda had all lowercase s's, no uppercase s in translating that. And I think, you might think this is not important, but yes, it is, right? It's how you what is the ideal way to translate this? Because it's using the same word, right? The same exact word, ātman. How do you translate that word? And is it the same, translated the same way each time you translate it? I would say sometimes lowercase s, sometimes capital S. Winthrop Sargent says the same. A lot of people here do not, though, including Aurobindo. Aurobindo's also was a little bit more kind of like biblical sounding language, like the shouldest, and the thou. Okay, Radhakrishnan. Let a man lift himself by himself. Let him not degrade himself, for the self alone is the friend of the self, and the self alone is the enemy of the self. All lowercase s's. He's also in Shivananda, my camp. Basically, no one here except Winthrop Sargent has said can be the friend or can be the enemy. Everyone more or less is saying the self is the friend, the self is the enemy. The question is it self with a capital S, or is it self with a lowercase s? Let's make this a little bigger so we can see. Yeah. Actually, Radhakrishnan is using uppercase, capital S, for the self alone is the friend of the self, and the self alone, capital S, is the enemy of the self. So he is actually doing what Winthrop Sargent did, and what I did, actually, what I came around to doing too. Swami Nikhilananda, he who is self-controlled, who has brought his body and mind under control, is his own friend. But in the case of a man who has no control over himself, his self injures him like an external enemy. So this is quite a paraphrase and quite a kind of a bringing in an explanation of what it means, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. You know, it's in alignment with what the Bhagavad Gita says, right? Because the Bhagavad Gita is all about self-control, right? So, yeah, self-control does bring happiness, well-being, fulfillment. Lack of self-control brings the opposite. So that's true. But, you know, if you want more of an exact translation, that's not it. That would be more of a poetic, free translation, right? That is explanatory as well. Swami Sri Atmananda, the self can be the friend or the enemy of the self. Capital S. One should liberate the self by the self, but should never bind it by the self. So instead of degrade or lower, he has bind, and he has liberate. For uplift or raise, he has liberate. Not exactly what the words mean, but, you know, once again, everyone is more or less getting it. It's just, you know, if you want more of an exact translation, mine or Winthrop Sargent or some of these others, like Radhakrishnan, are closer. But this one is more free. And he even has the two lines. You know, the first line, he has the second line first here. He's the only one that has that so far. And the first line second. So he inverted it. Which is fine. You know, you can do that. Why not? But it's not that exact, is what I'm saying. Prabhavananda, Swami Prabhavananda, and Christopher Isherwood. Man's will is the only friend of the Atman. His will is also the Atman's enemy. Now this is bringing in the will, translating Atmana's will here. And the Atman with the capital A, meaning the self with the capital S. It's also a free translation. It's also taking some poetic license. It's not, I would say, not great, but not horrible either. Somewhere in between. I mean, translating the Atmana's will, I think, is problematic. So, but let's go on. Sri Purohit Swami, let him seek liberation by the help of his highest self, and let him never disgrace his own self. Okay, liberation. He also has liberation, just like Atmananda had liberate, right? And he has disgrace instead of debase or degrade. Yeah, you know, you could. Why not? I don't know. Again, if that word actually means disgrace, or you know, if it really has that meaning, but it's okay. For that self is his only friend, yet it may also be his enemy. So self with a capital S, and it may be his, you know, his only friend, and it may also be his enemy. That's like Winthrop Sargent. It can be his enemy, right? It may be his enemy. It's not always his enemy. And that's the problem with translating this verse literally, is you don't get that little nuance there, which you would get from the next verse, from verse 6. And that's why Winthrop Sargent's might be the best. So, you know, but It's also not exact, but might be he's reading between the lines and adding something which is necessary to help understand it. Srila Prabhupada has, a man must elevate himself by his own mind, not degrade himself. The mind is the friend of the conditioned soul and his enemy as well. Now this is like that saying, you know, your mind can be can be a faithful servant, and it can be a terrible master, depending on how you use it. Now he's translating Atmana's mind. That is also problematic. And I read his notes, I read his commentary, his purport on this. This is Srila Prabhupada, and he explains why he used mind. So that's good that he explained that he said, you know, he says, I'm translating Atmana's mind here for a reason. But on the other hand, I don't think it's the best reason. And Atmana is generally not translated as mind, just like it's not translated as will. So that's... So in other words, you really don't... He has conditioned soul. You know, Atman is used 7 times, and from his translation, you wouldn't recognize that, right? He uses mind here twice. Yeah, I just don't think it's the best translation. B.G. Narasingha. Living beings must elevate themselves by the mind. Again, the mind, right? They must not degrade themselves. Certainly, the mind is the friend of the living beings as well as their worst enemy. Now, Narasingha might have used Prabhupada's translation. Prabhupada's translation came out, I believe it first came out in the 60s, but then he republished it, I think, in like 1971 or 72. And I believe that it has been updated and revised since then. But in any case, I think there's a kind of a consensus that Prabhupada's translation has issues. I'm going to go into that in a separate video. I'm going to talk about that. But Narasingha kind of is in the same camp, right? So Jeffrey Armstrong, who's also, I believe, either a devotee, Hare Krishna devotee, or he's in that tradition, he says one should use the divine strength of their Atma to uplift their own Atma and should not use their power to degrade their Atma. The Atma is the Atma's own best friend, and only the Atma can become the Atma's own worst enemy. So, the good thing about what he does is that he uses the word Atma 7 times. He's the only one that did that. Now, but he does not translate Atma. But he does have notes in the back of his book to explain what Atma is. Let's see if I can find it real quick here. He does have an index, glossary of terms. What does he say? Atma. Atma is the invisible, indivisible individual. Atma is not a synonym for soul. Soul is an Abrahamic term used to refer to one lifetime then consequences paradigm. You know, he has reasons not to translate Atma, definitely not as soul, which Prabhupada does, actually. Jeffrey Armstrong wants to decolonize the Gita. He wants to take out all of the biblical sounding language that is not really accurate in terms of what is being talked about in the Gita, which can be good to a certain extent, but also can be limiting because, like in this case, you know, soul does not need to... Soul is not just a biblical thing, right? Soul is a concept that's in other traditions as well. It's not just in the Bible, right? It's in many other traditions. So, not that he needs to translate it as soul, but I'm just saying, soul might be closer than mind, you know, or than will. Self might be better, but self is problematic too. The word self is also problematic. But it's self might be the best because we talk about oneself, higher self, lower self. So everything Armstrong said was good, you know, and I liked how he did it. He had Atma 7 times. So, but I'm just saying, you know, I'm trying to critique it. I'm trying to give a little critique here. Parama Karuna Devi, one should raise himself, herself, by her own effort. She could just say one instead of him or her, you know, him/her. I know why she did that, because she's a woman, and I wouldn't want this to. I wouldn't want a woman to think this is all about men either. This is open to everyone. Certainly, one could be one's own friend or one's own enemy. So this is like Sargent. She's adding the could be, right? Could be. Certainly, one could be one's own friend. And then she has one instead of his/her. Then she drops the his/her thing and she just says one, which is good, right? But she could have put that. She could have put that at the beginning too. Certainly, one could be one's own friend or one's own enemy. So she has the could be too, which I'm considering changing that to that as well. BhagavadGita.org has the conditioned being must be delivered from material nature by the realized mind. Conditioned being must not become degraded, since this very mind is the friend of the conditioned being as well as the enemy of the conditioned being. So this is also translating it as mind and conditioned being. So it's understanding Atman in different ways here, right? It's translating it as conditioned being and as mind. Yeah, you know, I mean, or realized mind. Conditioned being would be the lower self. Realized mind would be the higher mind, the higher self. Yeah, you know, it's always like this, you know, you win some, you lose some with all this. Eknath is sworn, reshape yourself through the power of your will. Never let yourself be degraded by self-will. The will is the only friend of the self, and the will is the only enemy of the self. So he has will too, like someone else we saw earlier. Now, why he translates as will is a good question. You know, the fact that he's translating as will probably means that he knew something, right? That he had some understanding of Atmana's will that I'm not aware of at this moment. So that's something to look at, right? But who else had that? Let's look. Yeah, Prabhavananda and Isherwood also had that. And maybe Eswaran was using their translation. I don't know, right? So maybe they knew something as well. Because those guys, I think, knew what they were doing as well. I mean, I respect everyone here. That, you know, I'm not putting anyone down or anything. I'm trying to get clear about maybe what would be an ideal way to translate this, and maybe there isn't an ideal way, and maybe everyone's translation is good in their own way, you know. And also in the context of their whole translation, maybe it does make the most sense. Sir Edwin Arnold, let each man raise the self by soul, not trample down his self, since soul that is self's friend may grow self's foe. This is an interesting one too. This is putting the shoe on the other foot. You know, this is saying that the individual self, the small self, can be the enemy, right, of the big self, not the big self being the enemy of the small self. And that's something that I didn't think of, right? And that makes sense, actually. you know, in terms of the first line, if you degrade yourself, then you are the enemy of the self, right? You are becoming the enemy. So maybe you need to rethink that. in light of that, let's go back. Let's go back to the beginning. We're talking about chapter 6, verse 5. Uddhared ātmanā-ātmānam, nātmānam avasādayet, ātma-eva hyātmano bandhur, ātma-eva ripur ātmanāh. One should raise oneself by the self, uddhared ātmanā-ātmānam, not degrade oneself, na-ātmāna avasādayet. So you could read this also as one should raise the self, which is how Edwin Arnold is understanding. One should raise the self by yourself, not degrade the self with the capital S. For truly, the lower self alone is, well, yeah, is the friend of the self, and the self alone, the small self, can be the self's enemy. You could read it that way, right? Why not? I think Edwin Arnold might be the only one that did that. So you could see, I hope, if nothing else, you could see how interesting it is that you have all these different ways, different approaches, different ways of looking at this, different ways of translating it. Hopefully this is like we're looking at the rainbow spectrum here. In the end, it's all good. I think all these are magnificent. Everyone is doing their college best. I'm doing my college best. I had a graduate degree. I took some graduate classes in Sanskrit. I'm not really a Sanskrit scholar like maybe some people are, but I'm definitely getting there from doing this practice now of translating the Gita. But I would say I need to think about this more. I would love to hear your comments, your thoughts. I'm not completely happy with my translation now that I've looked at all these, and I need to think about Sir Edwin Arnold because I think he was onto something there. So anyway, would love to hear your thoughts. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm going to keep doing these videos for a while.